Greetings, everyone. It's Trey Jadlow here. I'm here on this 20th day of March 2020. We're here in the midst of the COVID-19 lockdown, and I am here with my friend Seth Bloomsburg, who is a presuppositionalist. And we had a conversation a week or so ago, maybe a couple weeks ago, talking about the differences between classicism and presuppositionalism and trying to measure the merits and figure out which one is best. And we weren't able to really finish our conversation. We had some technical difficulties. And so he has requested that we come back again and finish the conversation. And I'm very glad to do that. So welcome, Seth. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay, so I mean, how are you guys doing? Everything okay with you and your?
Oh yeah, we're in, or at least I'm enjoying the lockdown. My wife is more of an outdoorsy person, so
yeah.
I'm happy to just stay inside and read a book.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. What part of the country you live in?
We live in near Seattle, Washington.
Oh, okay. But so you used to live in Moscow then?
Yeah, I did. I lived there most of my life, but I moved out to Seattle to get into the tech industry.
Oh, so did you grow up in Moscow?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Oh.
I went to, I don't know if you're familiar with the names, but I went to Logos School, graduated from there, and I went to Doug Wilson's church called Christ Church there, and graduated from New St. Andrews College.
Okay, so is Logos the K through 12, or what is that?
Yeah, that's the K through 12 classical Christian school.
Okay. My kids were in a classical school for a while.
Oh, very cool.
And it was, that whole movement is the baby of Wilson.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful for that. A lot of good stuff there. Okay, so where would you like to pick up? I'm not even sure where to give any thought to this.
I think we ended on talking about beliefs and how, is it possible for somebody to have a belief that they don't want to have? Is belief volitional, that kind of thing?
Oh, right. So because from your perspective, you were saying that someone doesn't need to act their will in order to presuppose something.
Correct. Somebody might have a presupposition that they're not aware of. They might be presupposing something that they don't want to, or you can have a belief that you don't want to or are unaware of. So belief systems, beliefs and belief systems have a number of characteristics to them. And I think one of them is that you can have a belief that you don't want to have, or you can have one that you're not aware of.
Okay, and so your conclusion is that everybody presupposes God, and even those who don't acknowledge God, they presuppose God, and that enables them to have a true knowledge of God that makes them guilty. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and what they do with that belief is it's a second order belief. So everyone believes in God, and they either openly profess it or they suppress it. So it's common to talk about believers and unbelievers. I don't have a big problem with the language, but if you want to be really precise, I think it's better to say that you have suppressors and confessors, because everybody believes in God. But when it comes to what their belief about, but when it comes to what they do with that belief, is people will often trick themselves into believing that they don't believe it. So, person P believes in God, but person P also believes that he doesn't believe in God. Mm-hmm. As far as the psychology of it, I can't remember if I used this example last time we talked, but it's similar to how, if somebody comes into a coffee shop, and you've probably seen customers like this where no matter what, their coffee is always wrong, or they always get bad service at every restaurant. Deep down, people like that know that they are the problem, but they have tricked themselves into believing that they are not.
Okay, so from your perspective, then, it would be possible to have a non-Christian epistemology that would give you truth?
No, because you can't have what a suppressor or an unbeliever will do is they will build their worldview on the worldview that they say that they hold to. They will build it on some other belief, which entails a denial of God's existence. So Hinduism believes that there is no creator-creature distinction, that Brahman is God and is identical with all of reality. So they do believe in God, but they suppress it and trick themselves into believing that they don't believe it, and replace it with a worldview that doesn't actually exist. When unbelievers do hit on or happen to have true beliefs that correspond with reality, what they end up having to do is borrow from the Christian's worldview. So they take a true truth and try to put it in the context of their own worldview, which isn't possible, but it's not possible for them to actually do that. But that's what they attempt to do when they have truth but cannot account for it. Van Til would often say that unbelievers are very good at counting, but they are not able to account for their counting.
Okay, so there's no such thing as a non-Christian epistemology then?
No, there is. I mean, it's whatever epistemology they come up with that they use to replace the Christian worldview, their belief in God that they are suppressing.
But a non-Christian epistemology doesn't really work for anybody, right?
Correct.
Okay, then why would you tell people that they need to have a Christian epistemology when it doesn't really matter?
Well, no, it does matter, because if they have a non-Christian one, they can't account for their truth claims in terms of the non-Christian epistemology.
Okay.
So an example would be like, if again, using Hinduism as an example, I've read the Upanishads, and it does state in there explicitly that there are no that logical distinctions are illusory, and that all of reality is Maya or illusion. And of course the problem with that is that means that there is no actual distinction between true and false. There's no anything that the Upanishads say is an illusion, which means you can't trust it. So it becomes a worldview in which all truth is destroyed. You can't account for any belief that you say you have. But you also might have a Hindu who says that, well, murder is wrong. Of course, everyone believes that. Well, in the Hindu worldview, there is no difference between right and wrong. There is no difference between murder and not murder. The fact that the Hindu is saying something that is true is accounted for by the fact that he actually does believe in God, but suppresses that truth. He can account for his belief that murder is wrong in terms of a Christian worldview, but he doesn't want to accept the Christian worldview. So it does make an enormous difference which epistemology you hold to. You can't justify your claim that murder is wrong in a Hindu epistemology, but you can in terms of Christian epistemology. So if he wanted to be able to truly account for his belief, he'd have to change his worldview and become a Christian.
Okay. So can I read you a quote here from Van Til, and you can help me out with it?
Okay.
It's from a Christian Theory of Knowledge. It's
oh, you're lucky. I've actually read that book.
What's that?
You're lucky. That's one of his books that I've read.
Okay. Yeah, I've got the book too here somewhere around here. But anyway, he says, if one does not make human knowledge wholly dependent upon the original self-knowledge and consequent revelation of God to man, then man will have to seek knowledge within himself as a final reference point. Then he will have to seek an exhaustive understanding of reality. And he will have to hold that he cannot attain to such exhaustive understanding of reality. If he cannot have exhaustive understanding of reality, he has no true knowledge of anything at all. Either man must then know everything, or he knows nothing. This is a dilemma that confronts every form of non-Christian epistemology. Are you saying that that nobody needs to acknowledge God in order to know him truly?
Sorry, can you restate the question?
Are you saying that someone can have a true knowledge of God, and it is not necessary for him to submit that knowledge he has to the Christian perspective in order to have a true knowledge about God?
Can he have true knowledge of God in his own worldview? Is that basically what you're getting at?
Well, I'm not even talking about analyzing it necessarily, because it seems to say that Van Til is saying that there must be an acknowledgement of the Christian worldview in order to have any true knowledge.
Yes, that's correct. But one of the, I would go back to what I said about you can have a belief that you either are unaware of or don't want to have. So an example would be, if I was talking to somebody and they said that, let's say I was talking to somebody and I said, well, the fact that you're alive means that you have a functioning heart and a functioning kidney. And let's say he said, "That's ridiculous. I don't know what those words mean. I don't know what's inside my body, but whatever you're talking about, I don't have one." Well, the fact that he is alive and walking around and breathing is proof that he has a heart and a kidney, regardless of what he says, regardless if he recognizes the terms, regardless if he's ever studied anatomy and physiology. People's belief in God is similar in that way. They can't escape their belief in God. I adhere to the classical definition of knowledge as true justified belief. It's true that God exists. It's true. It's true that this guy believes it, and it's true that he has sufficient justification or evidence for that belief. I mean, the evidence for it is everything that exists. Romans 1 says that every fact in creation is proof, is clear revelation of God's existence. And he may not be aware of that belief. He may even deny that he has that belief, kind of like the guy who isn't aware of what a heart or a kidney is, or denies that he has one. But that belief is there. And so he acknowledges it whether he wants to or not. It's our belief in God is so deeply ingrained in who we are as human beings that we can't escape it. And so it's not so in terms of his own worldview, he can't account for any belief, including a belief in God. But in spite of himself, he still underneath, deep down, does believe in God and has a belief in God, but suppresses that truth and says he doesn't have that belief.
Sure. And I would agree with that. I believe everybody has knowledge of God. And I don't deny the sensus divinitatis. The problem I have with presuppositionalism is that it conflates natural revelation with special revelation and treats special revelation as if it's natural revelation.
No, I don't think we do that. What we would teach is that special revelation is the worldview that must be used to properly interpret natural revelation. So, for example, with the Hindu, in terms of his worldview, what we would call natural revelation is just to him more and more proof that reality is an illusion. I show him a foam, he says, "Well, that's an illusion." I talk to him about laws of morality. Well, that's an illusion. So everything to him, in terms of his stated worldview, is just more and more proof that reality is illusory.
Mm-hmm. And so, from your perspective, I have a problem with when you encounter someone. All right, let me ask you this: do you believe that you can have natural natural? Is there such a thing as natural theology?
I think there is such a thing, but I actually don't think it works. When you try to reason using natural theology, I don't think the theistic arguments, the way they are typically formulated, work. So I think people attempt natural theology, but I don't think it's possible to actually do it.
Okay, when I say natural theology, I mean, I don't know, I don't understand really the presuppositionalist perspective, but do you agree that there's a distinction between natural revelation and special revelation?
Yes, I agree.
Okay. When somebody looks at nature and they come to conclusions without the Bible, would you agree that that's natural theology?
They can come to, we'd have to talk about what the reasoning process is, but people come to conclusions for all sorts of reasons, looking at all sorts of evidences. There are people who look at nature and infer that there is a God, and depending on how they go about it, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But I think because of total depravity, what they need in order to come to a true knowledge of God is special revelation. Nobody comes to a true knowledge of God without special revelation of some kind, either written in the Bible or a preached word. Okay,
then again, how is the sinner, the God suppressor in Romans 1, counted guilty of a true knowledge if he can't do natural revelation, natural theology?
Well, because there's plenty of natural revelation. Natural revelation is proof after proof after proof after proof that God exists, but the sinner, the unsaved person, distorts that natural revelation every time he encounters it, and doesn't.
Okay, if it's distorted, then he's not guilty.
Well, you can distort something in such a way where you are guilty of it. Going back to the example of the person in the coffee shop. I mean, we all know that the person ought to come to the realization that they are being the problem. They are misinterpreting, you got my coffee wrong. It's too hot or it's too cold or this kind of thing. That person is distorting the knowledge or information that they have in such a purposeful way that it's obvious that the person is guilty of purposely misinterpreting it.
Right, but they're purposely interpreting real knowledge that is true, right?
Correct.
Okay, so the sinner in Romans chapter 1 is taking a true knowledge and they're twisting it, but because they know it so clearly, they will be counted guilty, right?
Correct.
So they're doing natural theology without acknowledging God, without the scriptures. They're not using the scriptures, right?
They're interpreting natural revelation, yes, but I wouldn't call.
And they're interpreting it correctly such that it makes them guilty, right?
No, they're purposely misinterpreting it, which is what makes them guilty.
Okay, but they have a true knowledge of God that they're suppressing, that they understand crystal clear, right?
Yeah. I mean, the person in the coffee shop understands in a crystal clear way, yes, their coffee is right every time, but it's their purposeful distortion of the facts.
That's right. So they're doing proper, they have a proper understanding of God without presupposing the Bible, and they're counted guilty for that knowledge.
It would go back to, I would make a distinction between the facts of interpretation and the principles of interpretation. They always have the correct facts in front of them. Always. It's always proof. They ought, every fact in creation is something that morally obligates them to conclude that the God of the Bible exists. But unless they have the special revelation, they will always get it wrong.
Okay, well, if they're getting it wrong, then they're not guilty. You don't understand that.
No, I mean, the person in the coffee shop gets it wrong too, but they're still guilty.
Okay, but I don't understand how that ameliorates the problem here, because you're saying they can't do true interpretation of the facts regarding God unless they have the scriptures. But then you're saying they have a true understanding that they're suppressing, that they will be counted guilty for on the final day.
Let me give you an example. So, the prime miracle of all of the Bible is the resurrection of Jesus. It's proof that is absolute, undeniable, irrefutable proof that he is God.
No, it's not. That's not proof. That's an evidence.
No, it is proof.
No, it's an evidence. You don't. God's existence in creation and conscience are proofs. Those are called preambles of the faith. Any other evidence that you give, that you use empirically, and you try to state that it is a fact, it's not a fact. It's an empirical data that must be taken by faith. Those are completely different things. That's the whole thing. Natural revelation is proofs. Special revelation is evidence, and it requires faith to accept it.
Well, the resurrection of Christ isn't just. It's not just a story. It's not just contained in the special revelation. I mean, it happened historically. There were people who saw Jesus.
But it's empirical in nature. It's not analytical.
It's an empirical evidence. I mean, there's empirical evidence that's.
It's not a proof.
Existence.
You know the difference between a proof and an evidence? A proof is a rational. It necessarily follows as a conclusion. In other words, if there is such a thing as a creation, it necessarily follows that there's a creator according to the law of non-contradiction. That's what my argument is on the existence of God. It's not an evidence, it's a proof. And I've never had a challenge to it yet.
Okay.
Same thing with moral law. If there's moral law, there's moral lawgiver. It's a necessary corollary. It's a proof, not an evidence.
Okay. Well, let me tackle that. I would say, if you want to define a proof as, a rational discursive argument, okay, if you want to stipulate that definition, that's fine. In that sense, empirical evidences are not proofs. But that's because you've stipulated the definitions in a certain way.
No, I didn't make them up. That's truth. Do you know the difference between an analytic and synthetic statement?
Yeah, an analytic is something like all bachelors are married. So it's analytically true. It's true because
it's a tautology. It necessarily follows. In other words, you're not adding anything.
I understand the difference. I'm not convinced that there is. Willard Van Orman Quine was a Oxford philosopher. He wrote a book called The Web of Belief, and there's a famous essay called I read it several years ago. It's called the Two Dogmas of Empiricism, And one of the dogmas is the analytic-synthetic distinction. He argues in the paper that it's basically an arbitrary distinction and is more or less meaningless. So
to say that a bachelor is an unmarried man is an arbitrary distinction. You're not adding anything to the subject.
Well, when you talk about a dictionary is basically a history book. It's a book about how terms have been used. It's not like there's some kind of dictionary in the sky that stipulates that the word bachelor must mean a certain thing. It's just that we historically it's come to mean a certain thing.
Seth, can you hold on just a minute? I want to say hi to my daughter. She just walked in. I want to.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Hey, Seth, this is my daughter, Kayla.
Hi.
Hello. Nice to see you.
She's my oldest daughter. She's 22?
6.
Oh, I'm sorry. Katie's 22. 26.
Oh.
I've got 6 kids. 22.
Very cool.
Sorry.
Okay.
Anyway.
Wow,
Yeah.
you cleaned in here.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Been busy cleaning things. Okay, great.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Okay, I'm going over to Addie's office for a bit.
All right. See you later.
See ya.
All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So you were saying that the idea of
Quine argues against the analytic-synthetic distinction. He basically says that it's ultimately a meaningless distinction. Going into the details of that would take a while.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a matter. It's really simple to understand. You've got a subject and a predicate to every statement. That's how we do logic. And when the subject equals the predicate, it's not the same as the subject adding something synthetically to the subject. I mean, I don't just for somebody to sit, we have all kinds of crazy stuff being said by people that are supposedly really smart, but it's really quite easy to refute. And maybe I'm wrong on this one, but it's just like, don't tell me there's no difference between analytic and synthetic relationships. That's silly.
Well, I guess what I would say is I would just encourage you to read the essay. I found his argument convincing, but that doesn't mean I can reproduce it as well as he could.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we're here right now. We're not here reading a book, but if you can't reproduce it, if you can't in a succinct fashion that we can understand, then my point stands.
Okay. Well, why don't we go after what you said earlier about the creator argument? You said, can you repeat what you said about that proof?
That if there is an effect, there must be a cause.
Okay. So the more or less the cosmological argument that if you have okay. When it comes to that's a good example of natural theology or theistic proof. When it comes to the philosophers in history who've criticized it,
like the lame one that Hume did. I read it the other day and I laughed out loud. I thought, why does this guy take this silly man seriously? Or Kant, which Van Til fell dead at the feet. That's the problem. He accepted these stupid arguments.
So both Kant and Hume criticized that argument, and I found their arguments actually pretty convincing when it comes to causality. What's that? Oh,
hit me with your best shot.
From what I recall, Hume basically said, well, there are a number of problems with it. First, one of Kant's criticism is that first of all, when you're talking about creation, you're talking about natural causation. So the proof, the arena of the proof is all entirely within natural causation, but it purports to prove something about supernatural causation, the existence of God. So for starters, it's a category error.
Tell me how the law of causality can change when you get to the basically what Kant said is he said we don't know that the noumenal realm corresponds with the phenomenal realm, which is a violation of the principle of parsimony. You got to give me a reason to be able to say that. Otherwise, you're just special pleading. You can't say that causality before God and causality for us is somehow different because it's just an application of the law of non-contradiction. If you're going to say that when we talk about God, we have to rely on coherence, that doesn't necessarily exactly pertain to us, but it at least has some correspondence, then how do we even say anything about God whatsoever?
Well, one of Hume's criticisms was that when it comes to our experience of causality, we at most, if we can even say this much, and in a sense I disagree with Hume, I can explain it in a second, but his argument, he was basically an empiricist. So when it comes to his views of knowledge, he said that all we really know is empirical and knowledge, and that's it. You can't. So
which is stupid, right?
I disagree with that. Sure, I think it's ultimately a self-refuting epistemology. When it comes to his criticism of the cosmological argument, his criticism was basically this: in our empirical experience, we say we experience causality, but if you want to talk about causality and apply it to unexperienced areas of the world that we don't have empirical experience, we actually don't know empirically that the law of causality applies outside of our experience.
That's what Kant said.
That's what Hume said.
From what I read from Hume, he just basically said people assert the law of causality without giving any kind of justification for it. I just laughed out loud. It's analytically true.
Well, his criticism of causality was a little different. Basically, what he said is actually Bertrand Russell also agreed with Hume's.
It was an embarrassment. He said that everything must have a cause, which is not what causality says. He has no idea what he was talking about. He took it from John Stuart Mill.
So when Bertrand Russell, he gave a more succinct argument than Hume did. Basically, what he said is that causality is, you can't prove it. It's the assumption in the argument. So if you have A and B, two events that happen together, A and B, A and B, A and B, for first, second, third, up to 100 times, he says, what is the basis for believing that it's going to happen the 101st time? And he said that you cannot prove that causality is true. It's not the conclusion in the argument. It's the assumption that is used to draw the conclusion that the 101st time you will expect A and B to be together.
Right.
So he actually says at one point at the end of his, I think it's chapter 7 of Problems of Philosophy on Induction, he actually says that it's the law of causality is essentially arbitrary. There's no empirical way to prove that it's actually true.
Yeah, but it's not arbitrary. It's an application of the law of non-contradiction. For an effect to happen without a cause, it would need to be and not be at the same time in the same relationship. And therefore, all logic goes out the window. It's not arbitrary at all. It's a necessary corollary. And also, causality is necessarily analytical, because the only way you can describe a cause is to invoke an effect. The only way you can talk about an effect is to invoke a cause. So to speak of one without the other doesn't make any sense. You can't define the terms.
Well, if it's
irrational.
Well, if it's an analytical truth, then we don't know it actually applies to empirical reality.
Well, then how do you? Every empirical fact that we have is interpreted by the analytical principles of logic. You can't have. It's half the scientific method. You can't do science, empiricism, without logic. That's the only way that you can make deductions.
Well, sure. I mean, I agree with that as far as it goes. But
what do you mean as far as it goes?
I mean, you can't reason without logic. I mean, I agree with that. But what Hume and Russell's point is that you can't prove causality empirically. So if your epistemology is, well, the only knowledge we have is empirical.
Yes,
knowledge.
but you deny empiricism, my friend.
Yeah, I do.
So what are you talking about? You're trying to use your enemy's opponent to defeat me, but you're assuming my objective reality of metaphysics.
No, I think the way to account for causality is to look at what Scripture says about reality. Reality is controlled by God. Jeremiah, I think it's 33, talks about.
But the Bible doesn't teach causality; it assumes it. Would you agree with that?
I think it actually. It doesn't use philosophical language, but I think it teaches that. And I think it's day 4 of creation. It says that the sun is used to watch over the seasons. Jeremiah 33 talks about the fixed. I think it's the fixed order of the stars.
How about if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die?
Yeah, I mean, there in
the beginning, God created.
Yeah, I mean, you can use those as examples. I wouldn't. So it doesn't use the
all over the place,
philosophical.
but it's not taught, Seth. It's not taught. That's assumed.
It doesn't.
Logic is consumed. The law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, the law of this through the middle are assumed. They're not taught in the Bible. The circulatory system is not taught in the Bible. It's assumed. These are things that you cannot, it's not didactically taught in the scriptures, but you can see them being employed in the scriptures.
Sure. So in Deuteronomy 13 and 18, one of the touchstones of a false prophet is, does he contradict prior revelation? So it's talking about, the laws of logic there. It doesn't use philosophical language.
Right.
But there are passages that talk about causality in the laws of logic, but not in those terms.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree. Logic and causality are only you can only account for them in terms of a Christian worldview, and that's
right.
what presuppositionalism teaches.
Yes.
But if you assume the problem with the theistic arguments, such as the cosmological argument, is they make elementary logical fallacies, like, if you're not going to presuppose the Bible in order to prove God's existence, well, you're going to use some other epistemology. If you use empiricism and you try to employ the cosmological argument, well, you don't know empirically that the causality applies outside of your own experience. So the proof doesn't prove what it's trying to prove. And it's also talking about natural causation, not supernatural causation. So the theistic proofs would be an example of something that's an example of an attempt at natural theology that doesn't work. There are too many logical flaws to it.
Okay, but you haven't defeated the argument at all. You just basically said, well, it could be different, which is, again, special pleading. You need to analytically demonstrate that Romans 1 and Romans 2 are not analytically true. That's what Paul did.
Well, no, when it comes to the designer argument, saying, well, if creation is designed, there must be a designer. Well, you're already presupposing that the laws of logic are true, which you can only account for if you presuppose the biblical worldview anyway. So you're already, if you're,
but that's done through discouraging. That's not done as a presupposition.
Well,
in other words,
what other presupposition would you actually employ the laws of logic?
Well, when you say presupposition, when you must presuppose the Christian worldview in order to make any sense of anything,
Mm-hmm.
Are you referring to an a priori or an a posteriori presupposition?
Basically a priori, but I don't like the a priori, a posteriori terminology. But
well, it's a distinction that makes any sense. If you want to say it's an a posteriori presupposition,
no, I don't think it makes sense to say that. I mean, yeah. So yeah, I can.
Well, how does it make sense to know something that you cannot know until you learn it?
Well, there are plenty of things that you know that you don't know.
But you don't know triunity, Seth. You don't know triunity until you learn it.
Well, you can know somebody that you. Let me put it this way: if you have you can recognize somebody without remembering their name. For example, I mean, we've probably all been in that awkward situation where you've known somebody. I mean, I remember a specific example where I knew a guy since since basically elementary school, but I hadn't seen him in 5 years. I could remember his last name, but it was just like, I recognized him, but I didn't have the verbiage to name him. So I think that's
you don't know triunity apart from the scripture. Would you agree with that?
The Bible says in Romans 1 that everyone knows God. That doesn't mean everybody.
They don't know him. Everybody knows him. That's why they make sacrifices. They all know they're sinners too, and they make sacrifices to the gods, but they don't know the specifics. So, for example, we don't know that Jesus came to die for our sins until we learn about it. We don't know that God is triune until we read about it. It's something that we've got to learn about him. We don't know that. You can't tell people to presuppose a triune God of scripture when they don't even know him until they read the Bible.
Well, no, I mean, in the context of a debate, if I tell somebody you have to presuppose the Trinitarian God of scripture in order to know anything, I mean, I can take a couple of minutes to explain what Trinitarian means. So I'm not saying Romans 1 doesn't say that everybody knows the terminology of Trinity. I mean, Paul. No,
it's not the word. It's the concept. Now, they do know the triune God of creation insofar as he's revealed in nature, but Trinity is not revealed in nature.
I think I would disagree with that. I don't.
So natural revelation is the same as special revelation to you?
No. But
Okay,
the same
is,
God
is
is revealed
Trinity
in both.
is Trinity natural revelation?
God's existence is revealed in creation, and it's not a generic God that's revealed in creation. It is the specifically Trinitarian God that's revealed.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the concept of Trinity. Of course, when people know the God, they know the true God who is triune. But
Okay.
do they know Trinity through natural revelation?
Maybe I can answer it this way. So one of Van Til's proofs, when he talks about the transcendental argument for God's existence, is the one and the many problem. So he talks about how being able to relate facts to laws is one of the proofs that is one of the things that you can't do unless you presuppose the Trinitarian God of Scripture, because there's one in many. God's one in manyness is the ultimate answer to the one in many problem.
No, it's not. In fact, I just learned this. It's true. And somebody brought up a great point. Van Til's reference of the Trinity solving the one and the many does not solve the problem, because the many is necessarily linked to change, not to multiplicity, but to change. The whole concept of the one and the many, the great conundrum of Western philosophy, is how do you have ultimate reality as it relates to not multiplicity only, but to change. And God does not change in his Trinitarian nature. Therefore, saying that the Trinity solves the one and the many is a misnomer. It's not correct.
Well, I agree with what Van Til says when it comes to that. I think it does.
Yeah, but it's wrong. I mean, prove it. Show me otherwise.
Well, if you want to argue that way, then I think I could say, well, if your argument is valid, then God can't be revealed in creation at all, because there's change in creation, and if there was change in creation, then that would reveal a God who's changing.
No, I'm saying that God doesn't change. Do you agree that God does not change?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Okay, so would you agree that the many in relationship, which is basically effect, is necessarily linked to change?
No, not always. I mean, you can have a diverse set of facts that are ultimately unified in a law. I mean, that's what I mean. Just to take one example, the sign, law of electromagnetics. You have a diversity of facts, but one law that unites them.
Okay, but it's the diversity is marked by not by pure actuality.
Okay. So
if it's not marked by act and potency, some type of admixture of act and potency, then it's not diversity. Okay. Now it can be an instantiation. You can say for example, the law of, we can say that the color red or something like that. You can. I'm a realist, so I believe that they are an instantiation of something that is in the mind of God, but it is not God in and of itself. It is an expression that changes, that is dependent. In other words, the color red, as we experience it, is something that finds its meaning in God, but it is not God himself. It's part of creation.
Yeah, and I would say that the laws that are revealed in creation are reflective of God, but they aren't God himself either.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So there is a sense in which the change that happens in creation is revelatory of God without revealing that God himself changes.
Yes, but just looking at creation, you don't learn that God is one in being and three in person. You got to have that revealed to you.
No, I think the diversity and unity of creation actually does reveal, whether or not somebody would use the terminology, I think it does reveal the Trinitarian nature of God.
I don't believe that there's a pagan in the world that understands that God is one in essence and three in person. You could ask them, and they could articulate that.
Well, sure, they can articulate it. But
how would they do that? Where would they come to that conclusion? What in creation demonstrates that?
Well, there are a number of, in order to get the existence of God wrong, I mean, there are a number of directions you could go. I mean, there are monotheistic religions and there are polytheistic religions. And it's not like you just take monotheism and polytheism and put them together and you have the Trinitarian God. So there is, so you can look at the diversity of creation. And one of the phrases that Bonson uses in one of his essays, he talks about how the truth in other religions, it witnesses to the truth of the scriptures in its apostasy. So in the apostasy of polytheism, it still reveals the manyness of God or the Trinitarian nature of God. In the apostasy of monotheism, let me finish my sentence.
Okay.
So, when it comes to the polytheistic religions, it witnesses to the manyness of God in its apostasy. When it comes to the simple monotheism, of other religions, that too witnesses to the Trinitarian nature of God in its apostasy.
Well,
So-
yes, this side of Revelation, it's really easy to do that.
Yeah.
But before we have Revelation, we're not privy to that.
Well, yeah. I mean, again,
Did the
we're
Old
not
Testament Jew know Trinity?
yes, they did.
Who?
Any of them, actually, about this issue specifically, there's a book I read called Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus by Michael Brown. And one of the things that he talks about there is the Trinity isn't just hinted at in the Old Testament, it's explicitly taught. The terminology in the New Testament is Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The terminology in the Old Testament is the Lord, the angel of the Lord, and the Spirit of the Lord. And then he goes through and shows actually a good number of references in the Old Testament that explicitly teach there's a being known as the angel of the Lord who's distinct from the Lord and yet is also referred to as the Lord. There's also the Spirit of the Lord, which is distinct from the Lord, but is also identified as the Lord in a number of passages. So an Old Testament Jew, the Trinity, without using the word Trinity, because that was a term coined by Tertullian, they didn't use that term, but the Trinitarian nature of God is revealed in the Old Testament. So that is something
all faithful Jews that affirm the Trinity with a different word.
Yes, they would affirm the content of the Trinity.
Can you name me one Jew that does
that? Any of them? Moses. In Exodus 3, when at the burning bush.
Any Jew in history, just give me, Rabbi Jackson, huh?
Moses.
No, I'm talking. Moses did not understand the Trinity the way that we do.
Well, let me show you. In Exodus 3, when it talks about the burning bush, if you look at the text, it says that the angel of the Lord spoke for, and we're not just talking about any angel. It's always that specific phrase, the angel of the Lord. In Exodus 3, the text very clearly says that the angel of the Lord spoke to Moses through the burning bush. When Moses goes back and talks to the elders of Israel, he says that the Lord spoke to me in a burning bush. So Moses, and then he writes the account later. So Moses identifies the angel of the Lord with God, with the Lord.
Well, who else would it be talking to him, giving a message?
Well, I mean, they had the concept of Satan back then.
But an angel is a messenger of God, right?
No. The Old Testament, I think, distinguishes pretty clearly between quote unquote normal angels and the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is not just a messenger of God. He is God himself. There's not just, going off the top of my head, there are other passages that refer to it, but Exodus 3 is the one that I remember the best. But there are other passages, I think, at the beginning of, for example, 2 Kings, when it comes to I think that's the passage where the Assyrian army gets destroyed. And it says explicitly that the Lord commands the angel of the Lord to destroy the Assyrians. So you have one passage that identifies the angel of the Lord with God, and yet there's also another passage that says that they are distinct. They're two different entities.
Okay, so I don't understand. If it's so clear to the Jews the Trinitarian nature of God and it's no big deal, why are this Christians so stupid in the first centuries of Christianity, and it took them so much blood, sweat, and tears to hammer out the doctrine in Nicaea and Chalcedon and those councils?
Well, I don't think early Christians were stupid in that respect. It wasn't until Tertullian that they came up with the term Trinity. But
wasn't there a lot of grappling with what exactly this means?
Oh, sure. There were Trinitarian heresies that cropped up in the church, like Arianism, modalism, things like that. God was purifying his church, and
why did they stone Jesus if the Trinity was so clear to them?
Because they hated God.
Okay, they wanted to stone Jesus because he equated himself with God.
Yeah, and they said it was blasphemy.
Uh-huh.
Somebody can be given.
So wasn't that clear to them? I guess you're going to say it's just their will was in the way, right?
Well, yeah. You can give somebody proof. You can give somebody evidence that is absolutely clear, and people will still just hate you for it. Jesus did miracles in front of them, and they still rejected him as the Messiah. So you can give people absolute, undeniable proof, and they will still reject the truth that you're trying to demonstrate with it.
And as well as the disciples not believing that Jesus could rise from the dead, them being so surprised.
Yeah, they kind of took a while to, they weren't real fast. They weren't real quick on the uptake.
Wasn't super clear to them, was it?
Well, it became more and more clear. I mean, I think
Right,
what was
it
happening is
became.
I think what was happening is they were. I'm not. I might have to look into this more, but I'm not certain that the disciples were immediately saved when they were when they became followers of Jesus. But they became saved and then confessed Jesus as Lord.
Okay, that's quite a statement. Okay, well, listen, brother, I need to get going. I've got to go do some work for my mom,
Oh,
and then
okay.
we're going to have dinner over there. But I really like you, Seth.
Oh, well, thank you.
And you're very knowledgeable and very gracious. You're not easily offended, which I can tell you're a disciple of Doug Wilson. One thing I love about Doug Wilson is he's unflappable. And
Yeah, I have.
he never gets upset, and he's always gracious, and he's always got a wonderful quip. I just love to watch him interact with wicked people.
Yeah,
He's so witty too.
that really was driven home. If you saw probably the lectures on sexuality that he gave,
Yeah,
I think
it was delicious.
University of
Indiana.
Yeah, I think it was, and it was just. I know it was anything that they said was just like water off a duck's back. It was really. I mean, I'd known Doug for years at that point, so I knew that he would act that way, but it really impressed me the way he did that.
Yeah. I really love him for that. That he's he knows how to debate, and he doesn't go home crying. He just stands and fights. You know,
I cannot imagine him going home crying after a debate.
And I love that about him, because people will get. I mean, I interact with people. You know, I'm pretty cutting. You know, as you can see, my style. But if I think something is right, I'm just like, no, that's wrong, whatever. And some people get all upset and flustered. So I'm glad you didn't, because it's just like, that's just who I am. I'm not trying to be rude or anything. But if I think something is true, I argue to win, not because I want to win, but because I'm convinced that it's true. And if I'm wrong, I want to be open to be able to change. But I appreciate the fact that you are able to keep your cool and just keep on cruising through there. So, and I'm happy to do this again, brother. I appreciate the conversation. It's a wonderful tool for sharpening for me. And if I am wrong, I am happy to change my mind. I just don't. I can't stand presuppositionalism. I just think it's silly. But I think that you give it a wonderful explanation, and I would really like to continue the conversation, and I'll try to be thinking about other things that bother me that I can pick your brain on regarding the paradigm, and hopefully we can just continue to have a friendly but spirited interaction on these topics.
Cool. Sounds good to me.
All right, brother. All right. Lord bless you, and you guys stay safe. Be careful, okay?
Will do. Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye.